Dr. Craig, I think it is a good thing, says a lot about an argument if it is responded to a lot. And the Kalam certainly has had lots of response. And do you try to read as many respondents as you can get your hands on? Do people
Not
send
anymore.
things to you?
One's research focus shifts as one goes through one's life, and my focus for the last dozen years has been on divine aseity and the question of the existence of abstract objects. And so issues that I worked on earlier in my philosophical career, such as the Kalam cosmological argument, God and time, divine omniscience, recede to the back burner. On occasion, however, I'll have the opportunity to read a recent paper on the argument, and so we'll do so, but it's hardly the focus of my work.
Okay. And someone sent us this paper to take a look at, and it's a popular blogger named Fair-Minded Notions, who says he used to support the Kalam, but after about a year or so, he says he no longer defends it. We're always looking for maybe a new insight or a new opposition or a new response to the Kalam. Is there anything in this that you haven't seen?
No.
Before we look at it?
No.
Okay. Bill, the first thing that he addresses here after his introduction is what you mean by begin to exist. Is he accurate here in what he claims are your definitions of begin to exist?
He's mostly accurate, but I think that we need to step back and see the larger point here. The author labors under the misimpression that the argument is simply a semantic exercise in defining certain terms so as to prejudice the conclusion. He says on page 3, if we piece this together, we can say that if the universe began to exist as Craig has defined it, then at one point there was no material reality at all, and then at another point there was a material reality. However, the only thing that has occurred thus far is the mere defining of terms. Now, what he fails to understand, I think, is that it is the very nature of a deductive argument that the conclusion of the argument is implicit in the premises. If the conclusion did not follow from the definitions of the terms in the premises, then the argument would be invalid. So as a deductive argument, the way the terms are defined certainly had better entail that the conclusion will follow from the premises. Otherwise, the argument will be fallacious. So this isn't a criticism of the argument to say that once you define the terms in a certain way, then the conclusion validly follows. That is a requirement of a sound deductive argument. The question will be, once the terms are defined, are the premises true? That's the question. And so that's what he really needs to address, and not to raise cavils about the various ways in which the terms are defined. Now, with respect to the first term that he tackles, begins to exist, he doesn't actually give my definition or analysis of begins to exist. What I say is that X begins to exist at a time t if and only if X comes into being at time t. And then I give an analysis of what it is to come into being at time t. And he quotes here that analysis, what it is for X to come into being. And he points out that a key element in this definition or analysis is a tensed theory of time, that it is only on a tensed theory of time that things literally come into being. And he disagrees with the tensed theory of time. The question here is not the adequacy of my analysis of what it is to come into being. I think that's quite right. The question is, does something begin to exist if and only if it comes into being? And he thinks not, because he doesn't hold to an A theory of time. Well, that's just to say what I have acknowledged all along, that the way I am using the terms in this argument presupposes that temporal becoming is a real and objective feature of the world, that time is tensed. And I've written a 2-volume defense of the A theory of time and a critique of the tenseless B theory of time. So what does he say in response to that? He says the issue is that we have no good reason to think that the A theory is true. Well, I have provided multiple reasons in my published work for thinking that it is true, and even more reasons for thinking that the opposing view, the B theory or tenseless theory, is false. So he needs to engage with those books, which are not dealt with here in this brief paper. But he says the reason we have no good reason to think the A theory is true is because we have mathematically precise models of the universe that support the B theory of time or tenseless theory of time. Well, now that seems to me to be simply a non sequitur. Just because you can have mathematical models of tenseless time is not in any way a proof that such models are true, that they are accurate descriptions of reality. You can have mathematically consistent models that have any indefinite number of dimensions to them, but that doesn't mean that the world really is multidimensional in that way. It's not enough simply to have mathematically precise models. He admits, lower in the paragraph, it is very intuitive to think the A theory is true. Indeed, I think it is an ineradicable part of our experience, not only of the external world, but of the internal world of consciousness, the contents of consciousness passing one after another. The temporal becoming is a real and objective feature of the world. So why does he ignore or disregard these intuitions? Well, he says, because mathematics and science, specifically general and special relativity, have shown this to be wrong. Well, that is simply false. Both the general theory and the special theory are neutral with respect to the question of whether time is tensed or tenseless. And I have not only written a book on this subject called Time and the Metaphysics of Relativity, but Quentin Smith and I have edited a volume of collected essays by prominent philosophers and physicists who would defend a Lorentzian view of relativity theory that is thoroughly compatible with an A theory of time or the objectivity of temporal becoming. But again, he just doesn't interact with any of this work. So these assertions, I think, are hasty generalizations. They're too quick. I've already preempted them by writing book-length treatments on these subjects.
Yeah, and I don't like it when I'm reading something and it says, and if you want to know why this is wrong, read this, and it links you to something else, or this has been rebutted or refuted by so-and-so. And it's almost like saying, well, there's a paper somewhere out there. And even though you link to it.
Especially evident in the second half of the paper, where there's really very little original work, but he just starts citing the work of others to which, in fact, have already responded.
Yeah, I mean, at least synopsize it, you know. It's to link or to footnote is for further reading, you know, on this, not to say.
Not to punt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
there
we go.
I acknowledge that the argument is based upon, I think, the very intuitive tensed theory of time, and I have done what I hope is my philosophical duty in providing a very extensive defense of the tensed theory of time.
I got to say, as a layman, that I wonder quite often if B theory is even as popular as it is, and I don't know to what extent it's popular. It seems to be becoming more popular just because it's more exotic.
I don't think it's more popular. When I read the literature, I would say that philosophers of time are pretty much split 50-50
Okay.
on whether time is tensed or tenseless. I remember while I was working on this as my major research focus, I had seen some authors say that most philosophers of time are tenseless or B theorists. And I thought to myself, you know, for every tenseless theorist of time, I can name, right off the top of my head, 2 atheorists of time of equal stature in the profession. Not some unimportant philosopher matched with some important philosopher, but in every case, matching people of equal prominence in the profession. And 2 to 1, I could think of atheorists of time that would correspond to prominent or less prominent B theorists. So it's a controversial question.
He does say here that perhaps you should touch up your argument by making it compatible with B theory. What do you think about that, Bill? Is there a B theory?
I would like to
Kalam?
have somebody do that. My reason for thinking, for example, that the universe requires a cause is because it came into being at the first moment of its existence. The B theorist thinks that in beginning to exist, the universe simply has a front edge, so to speak. The universe no more comes into being for the B theorist at the first moment of its existence than a yardstick comes into being at the first inch. There is just, so to speak, a front edge to the universe as there is a front edge to the yardstick. And I have no interest in trying to defend the cosmological argument given a B theory of time, since I think that theory of time is just false. It's wrong. So I want to argue on what I think is really the case. But B theorists of time have pointed out to me that they don't think that things can begin to exist without causes. If, for example, a horse exists at T7 and doesn't exist prior to T7, they don't think that even though the horse doesn't come into being at T7, that it can just begin suddenly at that point without a cause. They would say that, of course, if something exists at some time before which it didn't exist, there needs to be a cause for why it begins to exist. And if that's the case, then the Kalam argument goes through as before. So I'll leave it to B theorists of time to develop a B theoretical Kalam cosmological argument. I think it's possible, but I personally don't have any interest in doing so, since I think it's predicated on a false theory of time.
Next, he gets into the definition of universe, and he discusses your definition. He says, Craig defines the universe as being all of material reality, and then says, this is hardly what scientists mean by universe.
Well, I took this definition from what scientists mean. He left out one word, and that is contiguous. I think the universe is all of contiguous material reality. It allows that there could be other universes which are causally unconnected with our universe. But any kind of contiguous physical material reality, I think, would count as being part of the universe. And I think that is what scientists mean by universe. And I have to say, Kevin, here, I'm not trying to be clever. I'm trying to use the word universe in the way that everybody uses it, to refer to this thing around us in which we live, and which is studied by cosmology, and probably is about 14.7 billion years old and is expanding. That's what I mean. I'm not trying to be clever here. So if he has some alternative definition, I'd love to hear it, and I think the argument can probably go through on that basis. So there's nothing unusual about how I conceive the universe.
He says, anyways, if we accept the modern scientific definition, there is no reason we couldn't say that, yes, this universe, as it currently is, did have a cause some 13.7 billion years ago.
Okay, that's what I'm arguing for. I don't see the problem.
He goes on to say, the answer is, we really do not know that.
Okay, well, that's the question then.
Okay.
I give philosophical arguments as well as scientific confirmations that suggest that on balance, it's more plausibly true than false that the universe began to exist. You don't have to know it with certainty. You just have to say that the preponderance of evidence is that that statement is true rather than false. And it seems to me that that's the case.
We hear this a lot too. He brings up Planck time. He says, I'll mention this again below, but the Big Bang model breaks down at the Planck time. We are fairly confident about what happened after Planck time, but are entirely unsure of what was before it.
Now, what he's talking about there is classical general relativistic space-time breaks down at the Planck time. But that doesn't imply that, therefore, the universe didn't begin to exist, or that we don't have good reason to think that the universe began to exist. Indeed, in my most recent work, I address attempts of quantum cosmology to give a physical description of the universe prior to the Planck time, and show that the universe still has a beginning of its existence. So you don't need to have a physical description of the universe prior to the Planck time to be fairly confident that the universe is not past eternal, but did have an absolute beginning. And again, he just doesn't reference what I have had to say about quantum cosmology and why that doesn't provide a successful escape hatch for those who would want to avoid the beginning of the universe.
Next, he defines cause, and he quotes Kalam Miller, quoting here, there is some ambiguity over exactly what is meant by a cause. In particular, we will find out if cause is understood in the classical sense, where causes necessitate their effects, or if causes do not necessitate their effects. If causation is understood classically, and the first premise of the Kalam is granted, then we run into a problem. There must be intra-universal determinism. But even Craig doesn't grant this. Craig holds that humans have libertarian free will and therefore are not compelled by anything in certain circumstances, but then certain things, free intentions to perform an action, do not have causes in the classical sense.
What I was thinking of when I formulated the argument was the Aristotelian or classical notion of efficient causes, that which produces its effect in being. And those causes can be free agents or they can be deterministic causes. That's an open question. But the argument, as it's stated, doesn't really even imply that. If you want to construe it more broadly, you could take it to be refer to any kind of cause, material cause, efficient cause, final cause. It just says that if something begins to exist, there has to be some kind of cause for this. Now, I deliberately formulated the argument so as to allow for indeterminate events like quantum decay processes, which on some interpretations of quantum mechanics are indeterminate events, or libertarian free choices, which are not determined. So that's why the first premise does not state every event has a cause. That was what Kant believed was a synthetic a priori proposition. Every event has a cause, and that would imply determinism with regard to events. But I don't formulate the premise that way. What I say is everything that begins to exist has a cause. So I'm talking about things, not events, substances. And I'm saying that if some substance, some thing comes into existence at a point, then there needs to be a cause that brings that thing into being. And I think that is very plausible and is completely consistent with there being indeterminate events like libertarian free choices and quantum indeterminate events.
Okay. Can I take a side road real quick, Bill, and ask you about whether something can be self-caused, caused by the self? A lot of times people will try to get around the causal premise of the Kalam by saying, well, you know, a person can have a thought are doing action, and there are really no reasons or external forces that bring that about. And so it came about without a cause, and I'm thinking, well, no, the self can cause something.
Sure.
It can be self-caused.
Yeah, though and it seems to me that there again you're talking about events, not things. But I would agree with you that selves do cause mental events and mental states. So I would agree with you. It's not self-caused. Well, it is caused by the self.
Yeah.
But it's not self-caused in the sense that it brought itself into being.
Right. Okay.
Well,
so
you
that's
don't
what I
mean
need to
the
get
universe is self-caused in the sense that it brought itself into existence.
Well, no, that would be impossible. You'd have to exist
I
prior
think
to
rather
yourself.
than use the word self-caused in the way you're talking about it, you should use agent causation.
Okay.
There are agent causes.
Yeah. Well, I've been trying to get that straight, but something could be caused by the self, by
But as I say,
an
it's
agent.
better to say an agent.
Because if you say self-caused, you'd have to exist prior to yourself in order,
Right.
in order to
You're
cause
going to
yourself.
confuse people if you start using that locution.
I'll confuse people? I'm confused. All right. So, yeah, we'll get that straight. In conclusion here, Bill, he says, if we recap right here, we can see how the game has already been set up.
And again, Kevin, this is the point I was making when I initially addressed this. He thinks it's a game that's been set up by the definitions, and that's to fail to understand this is a deductive argument. And so the definitions have to be such that in a logically valid argument, the conclusion will follow from the premises. If it weren't set up, then it would be an invalid argument, and then he would have a basis for criticism. But you can hardly criticize a deductive argument for being valid. The question will be, are the premises true once the terms are so defined?
Yeah.
And so he is quite at liberty to deny that the universe began to exist, or that whatever begins to exist, as I've defined it, has a cause. That's fine. Go ahead. We'll talk about it. But there's no game here that's being set up. On the contrary, I'm being very clear about my definition of terms and then offering a valid deductive argument.
Is it like this? Have you ever seen someone present a syllogism, all the points, in the premises, and then people start hooting and hollering before the person even has a chance to defend the premises? I mean, I've seen that. This may be a little bit of what you're talking about. When you look at the outline, the skeleton of the argument, it hasn't been fleshed out yet. And people will look at that and immediately start to deride it or whatever.
Well,
because
I guess what I'm thinking of here is, in my talk, objections so bad I couldn't have made them up. I'm referring to the objection that the argument is question begging or argues in a circle, when all the person has done is shown that it's a deductive argument whose conclusion is implicit in the two premises. And that's unobjectionable. That's the nature of a deductive argument. The question is, are the two premises true? There's not much of interest in the remainder of the paper. He mainly quotes from people to whom I've already responded, such as Adolf Grunbaum, Wes Morriston, Graham Oppie, and so forth. But I do want to clear up one thing that I think is a mistake. Central to his critique is the following statement: I find it hard to see how, if it's impossible to conceive of something coming into existence without a cause, it's any more conceivable that something come into existence out of nothing by an immaterial, efficient cause. The means by which the material ends up coming about would be the same in both the latter and the former. And then in the chart he provides at the end of the article, his objection to creation from nothing is, and I quote, that creation from nothing is on an epistemic par with a universe from nothing without any cause whatsoever. And I think that's patently false. In creation from nothing, you do not have a material cause of the universe, but you do have an efficient cause, which brings it into existence. So the universe does not come from nothing. It comes from the efficient cause that produces it in being. The only sense in which it comes from nothing is that it lacks a material cause. But for the universe to literally come into being from nothing would be to come into existence with neither a material cause nor an efficient cause. And that is doubly absurd. If you think it's absurd that something come into being without a material cause, even though it has an efficient cause, then you ought to think it doubly absurd that it come into being with neither a material nor an efficient cause. As I pointed out many times, this is literally worse than magic. In magic, when the magician pulls the rabbit out of the hat, you don't have a material cause of the rabbit, but you've got the magician. But for the universe to just pop into being uncaused out of literally nothing would be worse than magic, because there isn't even the magician. So if you reject magic, you ought to reject the idea that the universe came into being without any sort of cause, material, efficient, or otherwise. So it seems to me that that is a completely unreasonable alternative, that the universe had a beginning, but that it came into being without any sort of cause. The real alternatives are that the universe is past eternal, or that the universe came into being and was brought into being by a transcendent cause. And I have argued extensively that we have very good reasons to think that the universe is not past eternal, but had a beginning, and therefore it must have had a transcendent cause.